So as I said in the last video, we're going to go ahead and create a fractal pattern based paper. And as you might guess, we're going to have to access something to create the fractal pattern. Well, that's in a completely different palette. When we go under Window and we come down here to the Media Control Panels and we go to Patterns, which as you can see is the keyboard shortcut Control 8. Now, this accesses a completely different function of the program, which I don't want to talk about just yet, but I do want to talk about one of its flyout menu options, and that is Make Fractal Pattern. So if we just go ahead and click Make Fractal Pattern, we're going to be greeted with the Make Fractal Pattern dialog. Now, what this really is this is a Perlin noise generator, and it actually has a whole lot of options. If you're comfortable with working with Photoshop, this is effectively the clouds filter in Photoshop combined with the noise filter in Photoshop, combined with actually several other filters in Photoshop. So this is a really incredibly powerful dialog, and it's really unfortunate that it's sort of tucked away in sort of that only place where you can access it is that flyout menu. It's really incredibly powerful, and I'm going to show you how to use some of that power. Now, the first thing that we're going to be looking at here is the power. Now, the power is controlling the general size and shape of that Perlin noise, and we can get something that's very noisy, as you can see, like noise, or we can get something that's very cloudy, and we can get something that's even kind of bulbous looking like lava lamp. So generally speaking, we're going to want to keep it somewhere in the -100 to 200 range for this. And then we can change the feature size. Now the feature size is going to control how big those objects are. So I want the feature size to be fairly small here because I'm going to try to create a relatively tight paper grain. So maybe something around, say, 10. There we go. And I'll just go ahead and take this down to -100 to make these nice round numbers. Now I can control the softness. And what that's basically doing is it's applying a blur to that. And if I take it all the way out, we get something that looks kind of like this blurry honeycomb pattern. That's not necessarily what I want here, but just like I said, be aware that that is increasing the blur. If we increase the feature size, it becomes really obvious what it's doing. It's basically blurring us right on out. So you really have a lot of options with this dialog. It's really powerful, but like I said, what we're trying to do here is create a paper grain and not necessarily any other texture. So I'm just going to take it and keep the softness down, pretty much down to 0 or maybe 10%, and we'll call it a day. We can control the angle, which is not really all that vital here, but again, it's just sort of rotating it around in our 360-degree option here from 0 to 360, and we'll just leave it at 0. And then thinness. Well, thinness is basically kind of a blur effect, but it's a motion blur effect where it's stretching that. And this can be really useful for generating things like brush metal effects, for instance, and some other different types of speed effects. In a paper grain, a typical paper grain, you might see a little bit of distortion, a little bit of stretching of that grain, just because of the way that paper grains are made. This would be particularly true in linen papers and also in certain type of cotton papers, whereas wood pulp papers will tend to be more uniformly kind of homogeneous, like a thinness of 100 would give. So I'm going to put this down to something like, say, a thinness of 80, just to give us something that's a little bit of a longer fiber. Now, below that we have the size, and these are all going to be square sizes, meaning 128 by 128, 256 by 256, 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, and 2048 by 2048. Now, the significance of these sizes is that these are typical standard sizes for 3D textures that you would use in 3D graphics applications. Why they chose those sizes in Painter, I don't know, but a lot of what's going on behind the scenes in Painter, it has a very 3D base, and I suspect that this may be the reason why we're choosing these 3D standard sizes instead of maybe a traditional graphic standard size. We're going to go ahead now and use 256 as our size, and below that we're going to have the option of outputting height as luminance, gradient bearing, or the surface normal. For what we're doing here, we're going to use height as luminance. Now you could use the other two if those are what you need, but generally speaking, this is going to work just fine for me, so I'm going to go ahead and use height as luminance. Hit OK, and now we have a brand new document. We don't need this patterns palette anymore, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that out. what we want to do here is we want to go to our paper libraries and we want to go select all. Remember that Control A keyboard shortcut. And we're just going to go ahead and say capture paper. And we'll just name this one Fractal Temp. And the reason why is because this is not our final product. And I'll show you why. We're not going to have any crossfade because these come out of that fractal pattern as seamlessly tileable every time. So you don't need to be bothered with crossfade. It's one of the great advantages of using these fractal patterns. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And now you can see that we have Fractal Temp here in our document. And if I close this guy out, because we don't need it anymore, and I just make that our active paper, come over here and turn on our directional toggle and click, you can see there's our new fractal pattern based paper. And of course I could scale this down to say something like 50% and get a little bit of a tighter paper grain. But you know, this is nice, it's not bad. In some ways it's a lot like the default paper, but I can do better than this. I can get a better, more useful paper grain than this, and I'll show you how in the next video.